Data and reality don't always match up. Economists might be telling us that things are on the up. GDP is growing, inflation is down. So why does it not always feel like it? It could be because our day-to-day experiences don't match up to the data. We listen to our emotions over economic indicators. Or do we? Today we answer the big question: do facts or feelings fuel our economy?
It doesn't follow that an increase in GDP per capita necessarily increases the happiness of a population.
I've heard CEOs say this, and I think there's quite a lot to this, which is we shouldn't talk ourselves into a recession.
There is a cohort effect, and the impact of the events that we've described really affects different groups quite differently.
Economics is a social science, and it's actually the social behavior that is really important to understand.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Steph Dobbs and I'm joined by Ollie Carpenter, which is the first time that we've done this together. How are you doing, Ollie?
Really well, thanks, Steph. It's great to be here.
Exciting to have you. So today we are talking about data versus reality. Do you ever hear news reports about the economy that don't quite match up to how you're feeling? Economists might be telling us that things are on the up, that GDP is growing, interest rates are down. So why does it feel like we're not quite getting the benefits? And that's what we're going to be exploring today. Are facts or feelings a more accurate measurement of our economy? And how does one influence the other? So Ollie, who do we have with us today?
Well, thank you, Steph. I'm really pleased today that we're going to be joined by Linda Yueh, economist as well as a writer and broadcaster. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you so much.
And we also have Tom Simmons with us, who is senior economist here at Deloitte. Tom, welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to get started, and Linda, move over to you looking at sort of the economy and really taking it back to basics if we can. So we hear GDP and inflation mentioned a lot in the news. For those who might not be 100% sure, what are these and why are they important in measuring a country's economic success?
Yeah, it's a great starting point. So GDP is gross domestic product. So that captures the national output. So what an economy produces in terms of goods and services. And usually it's measured for a year, for instance. So you think of GDP growth for 2023 was, and actually we get quarterly measurements. So you get a sense if the economy is achieving, for instance, what the government hopes the economy will grow at for the year. Now, the reason we measure it that way is because ultimately the growth of economic activity is what GDP is proxying, how much stuff gets produced.
So Tom, moving to you then, what role do factors such as quality of life and affordability play in economic success? Are there other things we should be considering as part of that mix?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I suppose one of the big criticisms of GDP is that it's a fairly narrow measure of progress, economic progress, whereas policymakers and particularly governments who are expecting voters at the ballot boxes are more concerned about a wider range of progress. GDP is obviously incredibly important for broader social progress, but in itself it doesn't measure things like gains to welfare, how people feel about their kind of broader standard of living. And there have been some attempts to measure those other aspects of welfare, such as the UN's Global Happiness Index, but maybe we can touch on that in a little bit. So it's a pretty narrow proxy for progress, but that's how it's designed.
So it sounds like then it's not quite as simple as saying that high GDP per capita indicates that a country is a good place to live necessarily. So there's been some sort of studies showing the fact that countries like Romania are scoring significantly higher than countries like Germany when it comes to things like life satisfaction and happiness, despite the average income being much lower. What measurements might give a better indicator then of how people actually feel about the economy? Linda, perhaps?
Firstly, I think average incomes are slightly better than GDP as a whole in measuring essentially standards of living. So for instance, you can have a very rich country, which is highly unequal, in which case GDP just doesn't tell you anything about the people who are not the rich people. So average incomes at least tell you, on average, GDP per capita, so GDP per person, says, okay, well, if you take all the output in the economy, you divide it by the population, this is on average what everybody gets. But this also doesn't pick up distribution. So in other words, you could still have a theoretical, everyone should be this well off. And then it turns out actually the top 1% or top 10% are really well off, and everybody else has a much smaller share of the pie. So what are alternatives to this? The challenge with finding an alternative is almost all the alternatives are correlated with GDP per capita. So in other words, gross happiness index or human development index. So this is a very attractive one if you want to measure progress. And that's an index that combines education, hugely important, life expectancy, and health outcomes. So these are all things we would all agree are pretty good for measuring how well off people are. But if you look at how closely HDI, which is what the index is called, is produced by the United Nations, there's a very high correlation with GDP per capita. So in other words, countries which have high life expectancy, good health care, and education tend to have pretty high levels of GDP per capita. So happiness is a slightly different thing. So there's a number of studies on happiness, which essentially shows if you go from lower middle income and you go to upper middle income, you become progressively more happier. But the more you move up the income curve, it's no longer a linear function. It becomes concave. So it's hard to work out what really drives happiness. And part of the problem is it's subjective. You're pretty happy until you notice your neighbor has a new, BMW, and then you become a little bit less happy. So it's very subjective, even though objectively, should it affect you? Well, you don't have to answer that.
No, it's definitely a good question. And to be fair, I actually think this is going to be a great lesson in economics, today's podcast. So thank you for explaining some of those bits as well. It's useful. I don't know, Tom, maybe to that question to you as well, around that piece around measurement. What other ways are there to measure happiness, as Linda says?
Yeah, well, Linda's right on the correlation between GDP per capita and happiness and human progress. And that's no coincidence, because not only do average incomes rise with GDP per capita, but the amount of money the state has to provide public services also increases. So that's a natural correlation that you might expect. I suppose what's interesting, if you look at the World Happiness Report, it doesn't follow that an increase in GDP per capita necessarily increases the happiness of a population. And a group of countries that's dominated the top of that list for some time now are the Nordics. So the Nordics, and in particular Finland, I think, has been top of the list for the last 7 years, despite not being in the top 10 for GDP per capita in terms of the global economy. And some of the reasons that the report gives for that is it provides quite generous welfare benefits. The citizens report quite high levels of trust in institutions. There's quite good social cohesion. And also what we find with happiness or welfare is that people really value employment. And that might be an obvious thing to say because, of course, with employment you gain income. But also there are a lot of non-financial benefits to employment, like structure, self-worth, etc., which are also kind of included in that. So I think Linda's right. There's an obvious reason that GDP per capita is correlated with other measures of happiness. But there's also some kind of move for wiggle room around the margin in terms of what it is governments do that really kind of can move the needle on these things. But I suppose it follows that there is no magic source. So if everyone knew the answer to that, every government would be implementing policies to lift their countries up the rankings. So yeah, those were a few observations that the report pulled out, but it's hard to kind of pull out which measure in particular is really driving happiness, because a lot of them are correlated.
So we've talked about how economic success is measured, but let's get into whether those measurements match how we actually feel. And there's a few examples we could draw on here, but I'd like to ask you, Linda, really why there can be a disconnect between the data and the reality.
It's a great question, and it's actually one that's been with economics for over a century. So if you think back to John Maynard Keynes, his theory in the 1930s, you've probably heard of the term animal spirits. So he's a very technical economist. He introduced ISLM, which we're not going to go into, you'll be relieved to hear. But not only did he do the modeling, he actually then said, you know what, actually what drives investment is animal spirits. It's sentiment, it's perception, and then of course he himself was a failed investor of sorts for himself and for his college at Cambridge. So he did learn this firsthand. So even from, one of the most prominent economists, great economists of our time, there was always this recognition that it's not just the technical, quantitative that actually drives ultimately human behavior, because economics is a social science, and it's actually the social behavior that is really important to understand when thinking about why, for instance, the economic data and people's perception of the economy are so distant. So in recent years, I think there's also an issue between levels and rates. So for instance, the rate of inflation over the past few years has now slowed, so that most major economies are looking at inflation around 2 to 3%, pretty close to central bank targets. But if you look at the level of prices, so in other words, what people pay when they go to the shop, well, since before the pandemic, prices are now around 29-30% higher than they were in 2019. So just because it's increasing at a slower rate, prices, in order to come down, you actually need a period of disinflation. If people look at the inflation rate and then they look at what they have left at the end of the day, because everything they're buying is nearly a third more expensive, they will absolutely not feel better off just because the data says inflation is slowing to target. And in fact, this year has been extraordinary because we've had more than half the world's population have elections in their countries. And this to me is a pretty staggering figure, but something like all incumbent governments have lost vote shares in this year's election, because this inflation we're describing, of course, has been worldwide. It started with the pandemic in 2020, and then with the opening of lockdown, that's when inflation really increased because of supply chain disruptions, and then we had the Russia-Ukraine war, and then we had the Middle East conflict, which all of these things have been pretty inflationary. So it's been an extraordinary few years.
Absolutely.
But they're things that are out of the control of the governments, right? It's something that's, as you say, extraordinary, so they can't really influence that in terms of economic policy in a lot of ways.
Yes, that's always very active debate, because when things go well, governments are right there. But completely fair, because inflation, for the most part, in advanced economies, it's in the hands of the independent central banks. So governments, what they do can affect inflation, but the period we're describing, it wouldn't be a major effect. That's why I made that joke about taking credit. So as it's come down, yeah, I'm sure they've done things that helped it, but for the most part, I mean, these are global supply side shocks for which there's very little policy can really do except help those who are worst affected. And we did see that.
Yeah. But I think that is a good point, because voters don't tend to discern between the shocks and the way that they feel. So I suppose in their minds, their respective governments have presided over a period of really quite high inflation, which has reduced the amount that they can buy with their wages. And so they're not necessarily interested in economists talking to them about exogenous supply side shocks. That doesn't change the reality that they've got less money in their pocket. So it's a really good point. A lot of governments have been dealt a really tricky hand with the inflationary environment that Linda describes, but that doesn't change the sentiment amongst voters, unfortunately.
We'll certainly come on shortly to talk a little bit more about elections, but maybe for a moment we can just talk about a new phrase. We talked about animal spirits before. Let's perhaps talk about vibecession, which I appreciate is a sort of term that has been coined by a US economist, Kyla Scalon. Maybe, Tom, this is something you and your team have written about as well. Could you maybe explain to us, what is a vibecession? How does it work? Is this something new? Where do we start with this?
Yeah, it is new, and as you say, we can't take the credit for coining the phrase, but it effectively describes the apparent disconnect between the improvement in the macro data, which we as a team will be talking about to clients, and then how people feel about their own economic situation. So, as you said at the top of the piece, inflation has come back down to target in the UK and across lots of the Western world, and growth is picking up after a pretty difficult couple of years. But actually, if you look at a lot of the sentiment gauges, they are still at pretty low levels. And I think that primarily comes back to Linda's point around rates versus levels. So although GDP has many shortfalls that we touched upon, it's important in order for policymakers to understand the momentum in the economy and to adapt accordingly. Likewise, with inflation, it's important for policymakers to understand whether it's coming down or whether it's going up, and then make their policy action accordingly. So I suppose it's no surprise that there is this disconnect at the moment when we're talking about change versus levels. But in the UK, I think it's more understandable because in the UK, consumption's been pretty soft over recent months, despite this improvement in the outlook. And we put that down to a number of things. So interest rates are still at quite high levels, despite the bank starting to cut them. This incentivises saving over spending. And we think there is some degree of scarring as to the events that consumers have witnessed over the last 3 years, not only the geopolitical frictions, but also just seeing their mortgage rates go up. So I think having seen interest rates at below 1% in the UK in the decade that preceded the pandemic, I think that shock may take some time to feed through to normalisation of consumption and sentiment perhaps. But in the US, I think it's even more interesting because in the US, economic growth has been really quite strong. It's exceeded expectations and indeed the average across other developed economies. There was a lot of polling done in the lead up to the election, of course, but even earlier in May. And I can't remember the exact data, but I think it's something like 50% of Americans polled thought that the economy was contracting and that unemployment was at a 50-year high, when in fact the economy was expanding at around trend or above trend, and unemployment was at really low levels. So there is something funny going on between the kind of macro data that we can observe and the sentiment. And I think a lot of it comes down to politics perhaps. So when you cut the data by voting intentions, you can see in the US that actually when the Biden administration was in power, Democratic-leaning voters thought that the economy was doing rather better than their Republican-leaning citizen counterparts. So I think there's kind of interesting thing about politics and perception through what lens you're looking at your own kind of personal situation.
Definitely. And I suppose maybe picking up on the point then about vibecession, we've just had the autumn budget here in the UK, and to Tom's point, there is that point, isn't there? There's that lag point in perhaps the data versus what people are feeling. What can that mean in terms of taking economic actions, perhaps? And what happens in that lag period, and what are we likely to see here in the UK?
If we look at the economic data, standards of living, so GDP per capita, so average incomes, today are actually about the same as they were in 2019. So what we just described in terms of inflation is the same for GDP. We had such a big contraction in 2020. Even though we are growing, we haven't yet recovered from where we were about 5 years ago. So for people to feel better off, their actual incomes need to match what the GDP growth figures are telling us. And I would say for the US, it's just fascinating because it's such a big country. You actually really do need to break it down. But one cut of it is that median income, so that means that the income for the person in the middle of the income distribution in the US hasn't actually substantially increased since the 1970s. In fact, it's been stagnant. So yes, growth has been quite strong in the US, but if you think of the middle of the distribution suffering stagnant income, then the inequality in the US means that GDP per capita is actually, or median incomes would be a better policy tool. So I'm using that as an example because for the UK, we're a less unequal society. We don't have the same wide income distribution, but that doesn't mean the same lessons can't be drawn. In other words, by looking at GDP, which you understand, of course, we've described, this is just measuring economic activity, but the policies in the budget really do need to look at standards of living, of which one proxy is GDP per capita or average incomes. The budget, I think, set out how you can increase growth, so that's around GDP. There is quite a lot of debate around whether or not the budget set out enough measures to increase growth. And once you increase growth, because we're not as unequal a society, it should lift average incomes. But how you define spending to invest to raise growth, I think that's still the open question. So yes, we all accept we need better infrastructure. We also need green infrastructure. We also need digital infrastructure. And I've argued for some time that you cannot actually make the most of investing in physical infrastructure, or even digital, or even green, unless you invest in people. It's, human capital. You don't become more productive or more innovative because you've bought a computer. You need the person to use the computer to do it more efficiently. So to me, there's still quite a lot in the budget which still needs to be fleshed out, but I think it has taken those steps to try and say we will borrow to invest, which, by the way, goes back to the old Gordon Brown golden rule. So, good ideas just kind of come back, but the constraint is around how much borrowing. And I think that is something which is not just specific to the UK. I think unless you're the United States, all major economies, do have that.
Yeah, and I think the budget sets out quite neatly this challenge that we've been talking about with raising standard of living, because it seeks to address the kind of short-term constraints on government spending, so trying to lift budgets to improve public services for which public opinion is at pretty low levels, but at the same time recognising that the only sustainable way to do that longer term is actually to boost growth, so to boost GDP or GDP per head. And that's what the kind of capital investment side of the budget is designed to do. But it's quite sobering if you look at the OBR, so the Office for Budget Responsibilities analysis of the Labour government's capital spending, in how long it might take for the capital investment that will be spent over the next 5 to 10 years to actually feed through to higher GDP. So they think actually most of the gains will be seen outside of this parliamentary cycle. I think that kind of crystallises the central challenge for governments who are looking to boost their electorate standard of living over their parliamentary term, but actually the chance of doing that with improving kind of supply side investment is quite slim. The gains to that sort of investment is typically seen over a longer horizon.
And Tom, picking up on that point you make around public opinion, the court of public opinion as we like to call it, there's lots of differing opinions out there, and I'm interested to understand what role the media has to play in our perception of the economy and our experience with it, because that's something else that can influence the public opinion and how we feel about the economy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just one bit from me before passing to you, Linda. I saw a really interesting analysis from John Byrne-Murdoch, I think, who's the FT's chief data reporter. And he was saying that it seems as if media coverage of the economy is getting increasingly negative. And he ran a study which just looked at kind of mentions of specific words that you would associate with negativity or risks or uncertainty. And they have risen pretty consistently over the last several centuries. And what he puts that down to is media companies having more data on what brings clicks and what enhances engagement. And they know increasingly that that's kind of bad news or news that heightens your sense of kind of wanting to read to know if you're affected. And the one example he gave was actually gas prices in the US, and how coverage of gas prices going up is so much higher than coverage of gas prices falling by the same amount. I suppose as our access to this kind of high frequency news increases and it proliferates all parts of our life, then I suppose that kind of negative bias in the media will affect sentiment. And that has an important feedback loop because it doesn't happen in isolation. Your confidence about your future employment prospects and the prospects of the economy more generally may impact your propensity to spend, particularly on big ticket items like cars or moving home. So yeah, I think that's an interesting piece of analysis. I'm not sure if it's corroborated by other studies, but it certainly stacks up from a kind of intuitive perspective.
So there's a saying in the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And I think it has been exacerbated by social media because, it is literally real-time, engagement. And I always think it's fascinating because there's a few social media outlets that try to do feel-good news and public, I don't know why I always call it like public service news. I thought all news was for the public service, but somehow if you do policy or positive stuff, it sits outside of kind of mainstream news. I absolutely think that's an issue. I think social media is also interesting because the number of economic studies actually show that social media, because of the way the algorithms work, it reinforces your existing perception. So if your existing perception is shaped by news outlets, social media then enhances that by giving you in your feed the kinds of articles you're already clicking on. So the studies that I've seen suggest that social media is not worse, but the algorithms just reinforce. So you read something and you thought, you know what, that's stagnant income. I'm in the middle of the district. I'm middle class. I don't feel better off. And then you click on the stories, and then the algorithm just feeds you similar stories. And so it just becomes a bit of an echo chamber, or whatever, however you want to describe it. And so I think the speed of that reinforcement is also an issue these days. So, I know people on social media who then, deliberately click on stories which are the opposite or surprises them. And maybe if we can encourage more of that behavior, at least you get a broader set of feeds. And don't ever forget, and I always think of this when I say the word algorithm, which is algorithms are just, opinions embedded in code. So you're just being influenced by the social media medium you've chosen and the algorithms that they're feeding you. And different platforms have different kinds of algorithms, all geared at engagement. But I think they do vary a bit in terms of what they feed you or feed you less of.
Loaf Catering is one of the social enterprises that Deloitte supports through our 5 Million Futures programme. Loaf Catering is part of Now Group in Northern Ireland, where they support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter, just like the ones we have here in the green room.
So maybe on that point then around reporting, so I guess measurement is one thing, but reporting on it and telling the story of the data is a different, and I suppose it has quite a big impact on how we react to it. What are perhaps some of the changes that could be made when it comes to reporting and commenting on our economy, particularly from two economists?
It's a really good question. So I suppose as economists, we deal with data at a really high level. So we necessarily look at the aggregate level of growth or wages or inflation. And as we've kind of discussed at length, that disguises how people feel in different income deciles who maybe have quite different experience to the average. In fact, we know that the lowest income decile has been most affected by the inflationary spike because prices have increased in the categories that they spend the largest proportion of their income on. So things like housing costs, food and fuel take up a much larger proportion of their budgets. Although consumer spending may have held up better than you might expect because higher income deciles have more money and therefore account for a larger proportion of total spending in the economy. Actually, the feeling of that kind of bottom decile is quite different. So I suppose it's striking a balance between describing what's happening at an average level, which really matters for things like policy and businesses planning their strategies, but also recognising that there is a cohort effect and the impact of the events that we've described really affects different groups quite differently.
So in the context of business then, Linda, the difficulty is where the data and reality might not be matching up. So what can businesses do when a vibe session might be on the horizon?
So I've heard CEOs say this, and I think there's quite a lot to this, which is we shouldn't talk ourselves into a recession. Mm-hmm. And they're just reacting against, their businesses actually are doing, fairly well. And then they read the same headlines and they're going, well, hang on, that's not going to motivate, my colleagues. That's going to make my consumers more hesitant. So actually, I think for businesses, to be fair, some sectors do well in a recession. Defensive, companies where you absolutely have to buy their essentials. So maybe you need a broad swathe of companies to perhaps, say, well, actually, this is what we are looking at beyond the cycle. Because the other thing is people find it hard, completely understandably, about where we are in the business cycle. And you kind of think this is, you don't know how long it's going to last. You're busy people. You're not going to sit there working out if it's Q1, Q2, Q3. I spent a long time talking about economics, and I always define what the quarters are because I'm thinking none of my friends would be like, oh, Q1, that's January to March. So it's just things like that where businesses, the successful ones, have really good longer term core strategies to help them think about a longer time horizon. So I think maybe some of that would help to see, yep, Of course, we're in a different part of the cycle, and maybe my company does a bit better because of the industry, but looking ahead, this is what we're investing in, this is the exciting technologies we're going to incorporate. I think just giving a longer term perspective just places into context where we are, because literally, by definition, a business cycle has ups and downs. And so, knowing what it looks like in a year's time or a year and a half's time, I actually think that's just a more useful way of putting into context the figures that you're seeing, in this part of the cycle.
And Tom, I don't know, what should businesses be looking for economically to make decisions?
Well, I think a mixture of the two, which sounds rather obvious, but taking account of the kind of aggregate cycle as economists describe it, but then caveating that with some of the nuance that we've described. But I was also going to say that it's, I suppose, a vibe session, partly because of all the reasons we've described about cost of living crisis affecting different groups differently, but also I think there is a degree of uncertainty about the future business outlook at the moment, which is perhaps above average levels. So in our CFO survey, we ask corporates what the biggest risk is to their business over the next 12 months. And they've told us for the last year consistently that it's heightened geopolitical risk. So I suppose, yes, to some degree, the vibe recession is a consequence of the events that we've been through and the impact on household balance sheets. But it's also, I think, reflective of this slightly elevated level of risk that corporates are telling us about also. And I suppose in that regard, it's a difficult thing to measure. But the thing that our clients do are kind of working through those risks and what they mean for their business once policies come to light. So hopefully as the recovery in the UK gathers momentum and some of those geopolitical risks perhaps start to abate, we may see that vibe recession start to dissipate.
Finally, we're actually going to wrap up, and I suppose it means it's time to come back to our big question. So Linda, let's go to you first. Do facts or feelings fuel our economy?
So if I combine the two, I would say fact-based feelings.
Okay.
So in other words, I always think it's our perception of the facts. So it's Keynes's animal spirits. So when Keynes says the market has gone up, but your own investments haven't, your perception of the market has gone up is deeply colored by your own investments. And this is, roughly speaking, when he thinks of it as, animal spirits. They're just things that you can't explain in an economic model that actually drives investor behavior. But while we're on Keynes, I'll just give you my favorite quote about him and investment. I did write a book called The Great Economist, so bear with me. But he said, the market can stay irrational for longer than you can stay solvent. So there is a limit to investing based on your feelings.
Okay, that's a good point. And Tom, facts or feelings?
A bit of a cop-out, but both, as I'm sure you kind of anticipated. So yeah, I think we've talked about how consumer sentiment is quite powerful in driving demand in the overall economy and growth. But actually we still need to take account of those kind of high-level data, particularly, as Linda said, inflation. What's inflation doing and what that means for interest rates and therefore consumer behaviour in the future. So I think governments around the Western world learned that inflation is really toxic, or high inflation levels are toxic for their prospects at the next election. So I think, looking at inflation but also looking at consumer sentiment is quite a useful guide to understanding where we're at in the cycle. But also financial markets, they can be irrational, but it's interesting if you, I suppose, contrast the performance of equity markets in particular with sentiment in or about the real economy. Actually, equities have done really well in general over the last kind of 12 months or so, despite this kind of negative feeling at a individual level. So I think, unfortunately, the answer is take it all into account to try and understand what comes next.
Great. Well, Linda, Tom, thank you both so much. Thanks for coming in the Green Room today.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thanks
much
for having
us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.